Okay, so this is the Earthworms of the UK, part one, entoLEARN webinar, where we're going to look at some of the UK species and just explore a little bit about their ecology, the state of them, and even for some, talk a little bit about the ID. Though, please note, for identification, really, you need to be looking down a microscope, so we won't cover that in too much detail in this webinar. So I just want to start by telling you a little bit about what this webinar is based on, what information this webinar is based on. So I was hired by Natural England to do a provisional conservation status assessment of earthworms in the UK, and that's still ongoing. I'm still working on it, but a lot of the figures that you'll see today are based on that. Now, the data from that is about a year and a little bit old now, so we may have more records than I'm stating in this webinar because of that. There's a little bit of a lag, but just to give you an idea here, this is a summary of the data that was used for that. So we can see that we don't have earthworm records evenly from across the UK. So a lot of our information is very heavily biased on England data. And the Irish, Isle of Man, Channel Islands data wasn't used for some of the assessment because we were looking specifically at the UK. So we do have additional data, as you can see on the map where we've got the dots on Ireland and Isle of Man, where that I've used for some of this talk, but it's not used for the images that look like this because they were just using the UK data sets. Okay, so a little bit about the history of earthworm data in the UK so that you know where we're coming from. Because it's really important that we point out that there's still a lot we don't know and we're still learning all the time. And I'll try and highlight some of the things that we've learned in recent years when we're talking about the 10 species that we're going to talk about today. So the recording scheme was started in 2014. I launched the National Earthworm Recording Scheme through the Earthworm Society back then. And as you can see, we've been steadily gathering data since then. And we went from having very little data to having, we're actually up towards 30,000 records now. So yeah, things are looking much better than they were, but there's still a long way to go because that's under 1,000 records per species. So, and there are still at least one species that we have not a single record of. Oh no, we do now, actually, I made that up. But there's some that we have under 10 records of. So we've got 31 species of earthworm that occur in natural environments in the UK. We make that distinction because there are some species that have been recorded from hot houses or glass houses, the likes of Kew Gardens, etc. We don't include them within this list because they've never been found occurring outside of these heated glass houses. Not all of these species are native, and we're going to look at some non-native species today, but they are all found in natural environments. So the 10 species that we're going to look at are the 10 that I've highlighted there, and we're going to go through them all one by one. And I'm going to just tell you a little bit of information that I think is quite interesting about each one. What I've also done is I've chosen some of these and paired them up because the species are the information is quite relevant from one species to the next. So, for example, the 2 bimaster species and the 2 Icenia species, I've picked out those as pairs so that we can talk about them together. Okay. So just before I delve into the first species, I just want to introduce some concepts that we use in the world of earthworms. So earthworms are quite often described within what we call ecological categories, and these ecological categories are actually based on their morphology. We don't have as much information about their ecology as we would like. And there may be some discrepancies between what we say they do and what they actually do because much more research is needed. But these different ecological categories, if we break them down into 3 rough groups, but just bear in mind that it's more like a triangular scale and different species may have features from several or even all of these groups. But we have anesic species that tend to be larger earthworms. They tend to be deep burrowing, and they tend to have pigment, which means that they quite often have deep purpley, red-brown colours. And they will live in permanent vertical burrows. They'll come out at night to feed, and they'll be eating leaf litter and soil. Going up through the soil profile, we then have endogeic earthworms, which tend to be quite pale. They live in the top layers of the soil. They burrow all sorts of directions, but a lot horizontally. They can be pretty much any size, from small to large. And then on the surface, we have epigeic earthworms, which don't really live in the soil, although some of them do a bit. Like the larger anesic earthworms, they can be pigmented. They quite often have these deep purpley red colours, and you get them in all sorts of different microhabitats, like leaf litter, compost, deadwood, etc., and dung. So you can get all sorts of interim ecological categories, and like I said, they've never really. We need to do more field research to see how the reality matches to what we're saying based on their morphology. But I just wanted to introduce these concepts so that when I mention them later, you've got an idea about what I'm talking about. I go into this much more detail in the introduction to Earthworms entoLEARN that's available to watch for free on YouTube. So the first earthworm I want to introduce you to is the one that everybody knows. It's Lumbricus terrestris, which you may know as the lobworm. I've also seen it called the common earthworm in some publications, particularly citizen science publications. It's not a term I ever use. It's not a term I particularly like, because I think it's quite misleading. Lumbricus terrestris is definitely not our most common earthworm. It's not our most abundant earthworm. So if we're going to use a common name for it, I'd much prefer to use lobworm, which has been around for a lot longer as well. In the USA, they call it the nightcrawler, which is a much cooler name, to be fair. And it's called the nightcrawler because it's one of those anesic earthworms that burrows down deep and comes out at night under the cover of darkness to collect leaves and also to mate as well. So yeah, nightcrawler, it's quite descriptive. You can see a picture of it here. You can see that it's got that deep purple head, like I mentioned. It does get paler towards the tail, as we'll see here. So we can see on these pictures, it's got pigment showing that dark purple head. What we can also see here is the colour on the earthworm on the left and the colour on the earthworm on the right look quite different. The earthworm on the left is also a lot chunkier. There's a lot of variation in size in UK earthworms, none more so than Lumbricus terrestris. It can be as long as 40 centimetres, but most adults that you find are probably around 20 or maybe a little bit more sometimes. But yeah, it's quite rare that you get them up to 40. But you can imagine when an earthworm can be double in size as an adult, that you're going to get a lot of variation. The colour is extremely variable as well. So using colour to identify it is not, is a bit of a no-go. Now, it will also have very similar colour to other anesic species as well. So it's got that deep, dark purple pigmented head. What we can also see is that it gets much paler as you go towards the tail. It also is able to flatten its tail, which again is another feature that is indicative of anesic species. And it will flatten that tail into a paddle shape, as we can see on the picture on the right there. And it uses that to anchor itself into its burrow. So while it's coming out at night and feeding on leaves or mating with another earthworm, if it's disturbed at all and it feels like it's threatened, it can retreat quite quickly into its burrow because it's anchored its tail there, and they can shoot down quite quickly. What they'll do is they'll have, as well as flattening their tail, they'll have the hairs at the tail end, the setae, they'll have those extended so that they're gripping into the sides of the burrow. And earthworms can move just as fast backwards as they can forwards. So that's a little bit about what the earthworm looks like. It's big. It must be easy to ID. Well, you still need a microscope. So this is an image of a Lumbricus terrestris down the microscope. And what we have to do to identify the species is look at its head, which I'll come on to in a second, and count out where things are on the live earthworm. The main feature is this thin band here, which I've kind of tried to show you the shape of it here. And that should be, usually it's on segments 33 to 36, but there might be a little bit of variation with that. So you need to count the segments and figure and establish where that feature is, which can be really, really tricky to do with a live earthworm that is not keeping still and moving in every direction, because earthworms don't just move forwards and backwards and stretch and contract. They twist and turn and all sorts. So yeah, if we have a look at those other features, so that's what we call the tubercular pubitatis, the TP, up close. And it can be anywhere from starting on 32 to 33, and it should go through to either 36 or 37. And another really important feature is the grooves on the top of the head. And if they go all the way to the second segment, like they do here, we call that tanilobic. I've tried to indicate with the purple lines here, and we can see that they do there. And those two features are enough for me to be able to say that that is Lumbricus terrestris. But yeah, I just wanted to point out, even though it's a big, chunky earthworm, you're still looking at really small features to identify them. A field sign of Lumbricus terrestris is a bit more distinctive, though, is the presence of middens. And we believe that it's only really Lumbricus terrestris that does this, although there is a rare species that we'll cover in a future webinar called Lumbricus friendly that may also create middens. So middens are piles of things that block the entrance to an earthworm burrow. And we can see here, we've got soil, which will be made from the casts of earthworms, the poo of earthworms, with some sticks. You can see here some grass. They also use stones. They'll use whatever they can find to block it up. And we believe they do this to stop air, stop desiccation with air blowing across and dehydrating, desiccating the earthworm. The middens can be quite tricky to see sometimes. So this is one from the side, photo by Frank Ashwood, and we can see it's a little bit of a pile. So once you've got your eye in, they're quite easy to see, but it can be quite easy to miss them if you don't know what you're looking for. And on the next photo, we've got a few. So we can see here that we've got a few different ones, and the distance between those will be exactly what the earthworms need to mate. So they tend to both like to have their tail anchored while they're mating, so there'll be the right distance for stretching out and coming into contact with one another. And the earthworms, when they're mating, they will be essentially what is a 69 position. So what do we know about Lumbricus terrestris in the UK? So you've heard that it's called the common earthworm. Is it really common? Well, it is relatively common. It is relatively widespread across the whole of the UK. But it does have a moderate habitat specificity. So there are some habitats you find it less in. And although it's not a species that we're worried about at the moment, it's found in all the UK countries, it does face some threats that mean that it could be at risk in the future. So a couple of those that I just want to mention are, first of all, it is really susceptible to disturbance, so to things like ploughing. It's a relatively long-lived species. It can live a number of years. So if its burrows are being destroyed, it might even be chopped up during ploughing. But best case scenario is losing its home. Then that's a lot of energy and effort for it to rebuild that. So there are other species of earthworm that are much better at dealing with disturbance, not this one. And a threat that we really need to keep an eye on is the New Zealand flatworm. So the New Zealand flatworm is a species of flatworm from, you guessed it, New Zealand, that was introduced here probably through the import of potted plants. And it feeds exclusively, I believe, on earthworms, and possibly really specializes in anisic earthworms, particularly Lumbricus terrestris. Now, research has shown that it could have a fairly significant impact on Lumbricus terrestris, although maybe not as much as we at first feared. But anecdotally, I've been informed by recorders up in Scotland that where they get this, they get plenty of it, and they don't get the big earthworms. So that would include Lumbricus terrestris. So it is something that is possibly quite a serious threat to this species, and time will tell whether it does have a significant impact on numbers. So the next species we're going to take a quick look at is Aparettidia longa, and that is the black-headed worm. It's another anisic earthworm. So when we look at this picture here, we can see it looks very similar to Lumbricus terrestris. There's a little bit of a difference in colour from some of the pictures that I showed you. It's got maybe a bit of a darker head, but that's a bit of a red herring, because I don't know if you remember from the pictures of Lumbricus terrestris, there was quite a bit of variation in the colour there. It's going to be the same with Aparettidia longa. And here we've got one that looks very, very much like, on the left, Lumbricus terrestris, and one on the right, which I really did not think this was Aparettidia longa when I sampled it. It was quite a big earthworm, but it was very pale. I found it in the bank of or maybe even under a rock in a stream in Wales. And when I identified it, it was Aparettidia longa. And I'm certain, even though that looked like a species superficially that we're going to cover later on called Aparettidia caliginosa, but I just wanted to highlight again, the colour can be a complete red herring when it comes to identifying earthworms. So how do we identify it if we can't rely on colour? Well, we can see even with this preserved specimen, it's retained some of that dark head. So again, typical anisic behaviour feature. We can see it's got a band just like Lumbricus terrestris, really, and that is on segments 32 to 34 on this specimen. What we actually can't see is the head is epilobic, so the head is different to Lumbricus terrestris, but we can see that this band is in a very similar region, a very similar area. So again, this is why we really do need to look in detail at them under the microscope. One thing where it does differ from Lumbricus terrestris is we're not aware of Aparettidia longa creating middens. We have found it within burrows where there are middens, but we believe that it's reusing Lumbricus terrestris burrows. What it will do is create these towers of casts, earthworm cast on the surface. So that's something that Aparettidia longa loves doing. There are other anisic species that do same behavior, so we can't say for certain from this that it is Aparettidia longa, but I just wanted to show you a little bit how it might differ from Lumbricus terrestris. So what do we know about it? Well, it's widespread. It has a much lower habitat specificity than Lumbricus terrestris, so you will pretty much find this anywhere. And last year, I noticed it really was everywhere. I was finding it more commonly than I found it any other year, and it seemed to be in bigger numbers than I usually find it. You do quite often, the individuals are quite often a bit smaller than Lumbricus terrestris, so they still can get to a decent size. But this is not a species that we're really worried about. So it seems to be a little bit more robust than Lumbricus terrestris. So moving on now to one of its relatives, Aparettidia caliginosa, otherwise known as a grey worm. Now, looking at the worm on the screen there, you wouldn't understand why it's called the grey worm, but sometimes it can be quite grey in colour, although the colour that you see there is how I feel it most commonly looks. Now, in contrast to the previous two species, this is an endogaeic species, meaning that you find it in the top layers of the soil. Rather than deep burrowing and coming out in the evening. You'll only really see this on the surface after a period of rain, where they'll sometimes use the cover of the surface water to disperse. Now, this species is really 3 species minimum. It actually is quite cryptic, and genetic work on the continent has shown that we have more than 1 species, although they haven't been separated morphologically. You do notice when you're sampling for this, there is quite a lot of variation in colour, there's variation in size, and that can be quite significant. So there's a possibility that we've got different species inhabiting different niches, although there is also a possibility that these species actually are found across all the different niches, and that's not what separates them out. So we've still got a lot to learn with this. It's a really disturbance tolerant species. So it's very widespread, very low habitat specificity. You'll get it pretty much anywhere, and it's very common. Where you get habitats where it's very disturbed and other species will struggle to maintain a population, it appears in fairly big numbers. So this and another species we're going to look at later called Alalobophora chlorotica, when the soil's not great for supporting earthworms, you'll get a lot of these earthworms. So it's for this reason I'm not a huge fan of earthworm surveys that look at abundance, because you might have soils that are not that great, that have been ploughed to death essentially, but you'll still get fairly decent numbers of this. So that can be misleading in terms of earthworm numbers. I think a diverse community of earthworms is really what you want for healthy soils. So it's not one we worry about. It's also my least favorite earthworm to try and ID, because even though it's very common, I feel like it varies a lot more than the books say it does. And that leads us on to the next one, which is Aparectidea nocturna. So Aparectidea nocturna does not have a common name. It's not as well known as the other anisics that we've talked about today. And in this photo, it's the one on the top. The one on the bottom is Aparectidea caliginosa. And the reason I'm showing them together is, first of all, I don't know if Aparectidea nocturna on its own. But until fairly recently, they were classed as the same species, but they were classed as what we call different morphs within the species. And the nocturna morph, which is now a separate species, is an anisic earthworm, whereas Aparectidea caliginosa is an endozoic earthworm. So they're believed to have very different ecology. Identifying it basically, looking at it down the microscope, it'll essentially come out the same as Aparectidea caliginosa. So what I didn't show you with that is that has these 2 bumps as a tubercular pubitatis, a TP, and that's a feature that really gives away that species. You find them on segments 31 to 33. But again, you really need to look down a microscope, because there's a lot of similarities here between this species and Aparectidea longa as well, the black-headed worm that we heard about earlier. So yeah, separating these out can be very, very difficult. And as a result, we have very little information on these. So a lot of the data we have pre-2018, we don't know whether it were the specimens that were recorded were Aparectidea caliginosa or Aparectidea nocturna. So as a result, our information is pretty limited. Provisionally, we would say this might be near threatened because we have but that might just be that we have so little data. It's certainly not one of the species that you find very commonly, but where we've done a lot of surveying in and around in London, we are finding it intermittently. So it might not be as rare as this map indicates, and it might not be as restricted in distribution as this map indicates. Though I do believe it probably does have a higher habitat specificity than some of the other anisic species. So we can see at the time of this assessment, there was only 49 records for it in the UK, and it's only being found in a relatively small percentage of the biocounts across the UK. So this is one that we need a lot more information on, and we'll be particularly looking for this in the near future. Yeah. Okay. So our next species is Allelobifora chlorotica, and that's common name is the greenworm. And like Aparectodia caliginosa, the grey worm that we mentioned earlier, it is an endozoic earthworm. So it'll be found within the soil. And I've borrowed an image here from a good friend of mine, Frank Ashwood, showing you the greenworm within the soil. So, okay, we'll come back to that in a sec. So just like caliginosa, this is a widespread species with a very low habitat specificity. You will find this pretty much anywhere and everywhere. It's very common, and just like the grey worm, Aparectodia caliginosa, when you get really disturbed soils, you'll still get this, and you'll get it in relatively high numbers. So finding lots of this in a place doesn't necessarily mean you've got the best soils. It possibly means that other species are struggling to get a hold there, so this one is therefore thriving. So it's not a species conservation-wise that we're too worried about. It does well even in really ploughed fields. Something that is quite interesting though is it comes in two different colour morphs. So it comes in a green morph on the left, hence its name, the greenworm, but also in a pink morph, as you can see on the right. We don't tend to confuse this with other species when we're identifying it because it has a really distinctive TP, that feature we were talking about earlier. And you can see here on this pink one, on its saddle, it's got three kind of slits. That's the TP for this species that makes it quite distinctive. However, when you're looking at these earthworms down the microscope when they're being preserved, the colour fades straight away. So the colour is the colour is produced by the earthworm. So the green ones you tend to find in wetter conditions, and the pink form, the pink morph, you'll get in drier conditions, but you can get them within the same area, within the same habitat. So they're not, they do coincide with one another. They're both very common, they're both very widespread. There has been work to look at the genetics of these to see if they're two distinct species, and those results have been a little bit tricky to decipher. So again, it looks like we've got multiple species, but they don't neatly fit necessarily into the colour morphs. So this is something that still needs a bit more work, and then once they're separated into different species, we need to look at what the different ecology of those is as well, etc. So a lot of work to do there. It's very useful if our recorders record the colour live, but that can be tricky when you're sampling them live, but then identifying them from preserved specimens. So our next species of earthworm is Icenella tetrahedra, and this is an earthworm species that most of you will probably never have seen, but it is one of our most common species, and it's actually the species that we have the most records for within the National Earthworm Recording Scheme. It's an endozoic species, meaning it lives in the top layers of the soil, and I'll come on to how it specialises a little bit in a second. Its common name is a square-tailed worm. You can't really tell from this, but that's because it has a very square-shaped tail. It is a wet soil specialist, so it thrives in wetlands, and that includes in the bottom of rivers and streams, in the bottom of lakes and ponds, and also in the margins as well. But you will also find this anywhere where there's wet soil conditions. So even where those wet soil conditions are fairly remote, fairly isolated, it seems to be able to colonize really well. We don't fully understand how, but you'll get it in a wet patch in a garden, and you might not find it in that wet patch at other times of the year. So I'm really fascinated by this species. Microhabitat wise, you'll normally find it in the soil, but you can also find it from other microhabitats where wet soil conditions are present. So, for example, under deadwood, under other items, in leaf litter, etc. And we identify this, one of its main identification features is its male paw. So the male paw is this feature that you can see on the earthworm. On some species, it's really indistinct. On others, it's quite distinctive, as you can see there. And it's normally found on segment 15 of an earthworm. In Icenella tetrahedra, it can be on a number of different segments, including 15, but it can also be on 12, 13, 14. I've even found one where it's on much earlier, but we're not sure if that's a mutant or if that means it can be found even earlier. And one thing I've noticed with this species is that it is found on quite a number. It can be found in quite a number of different colours. It's really, really variable. We don't necessarily know if these different colours match up with the different morphs, because until recently, not many people were recording the morph, the male paw, where the male paw was located. So I'm trying to figure out personally whether the colour relates to where the male paw is or whether it's something else. But all of these pictures here are Icenella tetrahedra, not all necessarily with the male paw in the same place, but they all look very different. And if you were to look at these 4 images, you might think that this could easily be 4 different species of earthworm, but it's not. They're all the same. So again, another lesson as to why colour is not the most reliable. And I'm actually going to show you some species shortly that look much more similar to the one in the bottom left than the one in the bottom left does look to the one in the top right. Okay, we've already been through that. So Icenella tetrahedra is a widespread species. Although you only get it in wet soil conditions, you will get it in a wide range of habitats. So it still has quite a low habitat specificity, and it's common. Now, it looks like it's really densely populated in England in this map, and much less distributed in southwest England, in Wales, Scotland, etc. That's not necessarily the case. The reason is because we have a unique data set for most of England, where the Environment Agency do kick sampling in rivers, and the only species of earthworm that they identified species in those surveys is Icenella tetrahedra. Anything else, just any other species of earthworm, just get grouped together and recorded as earthworm. So we've got a really, really good data set with lots of data. If I took that data out of that map there, it would look much more sparse. So yeah, just bear in mind, this is the data looks much better for this species just because we've got one specific data set that fills in the gap. But that data set means that it makes up over a quarter of all UK earthworm records. So yeah, we've got good data for this species. We know it's not a species that's at risk, even though this is a species that people rarely come across. So next species is Icenia foetida. This is a species that most people are familiar with. It is known as the tiger worm, and you can see from this photo why it has that name. So this is a particularly stripy specimen for the species even. Tiger worm is a United States term for it. In England and the rest of the UK, it's more commonly known as the branding worm. But it's been used for composting for a long time, and it is the main species that is used for composting, which means it falls within the epigeic categories. In the wild, you'll find it in deadwood, you'll find it in dung, and you'll find it in areas where there's loads of leaf that are decaying. So where you've got a concentration of organic content breaking down, you'll find this species. It is really common, probably, but we have to know that it is common, not uncommon. That is wrong. That's a mistype there. It does have a high habitat specificity, so you don't tend to find it just freely occurring in the soils unless there's a cowpat or something like that above it. But just like with the wet soil specialist Icenia tetrahedra, it's able to colonize these specialist conditions that it likes really well, and we don't necessarily know how or where it's coming from to do that. It's moderately widespread as well. The data you see here, it looks like it might be quite restricted. It looks like it might have not be in certain parts of the country, and it doesn't look as common as some of the other really common species. This is to do with sampling biases. Researchers don't tend to look in compost heaps. They tend to be surveying agricultural soils. So it's not that this is not common, it's that we have relatively small amounts of sampling from the areas where you would, from the habitats that you would find this. We need to do more sampling for this, and we could really do with a project that looks in compost bins across the UK, and we'd see a lot more dots on the map. So as an example, in Northern Ireland, all of our data is pretty much from research looking at soil pit sampling in agricultural fields. So that's why we don't really have it much there. But it is found in all UK countries. It is probably fairly common. However, identifying it is not too easy because it has a sister species, Icenia andreae, where the only way to tell these apart is on their colour live. So when you look at them down a microscope, they come out exactly the same. The stripiness disappears when you preserve them in ethanol. Icenia andreae is a species that we didn't even accept records for until recently, because it can only really be identified and differentiated from Icenia foetida reliably using DNA. However, recent records make it look like there probably is a way of telling the difference depending on how stripy they are. So we can see, oh, actually, I can come back to that. We can see here that Icenia andreae still is stripy. So it has a level of stripiness to it, but it's not as stripy as Icenia foetida. So separating them is very difficult. It's something that I need to do a bit more work on so that I can put together some reliable guidance. But at the moment, we accept records mostly of these as what we call an aggregate. So you record it as Icenia foetida / andreae ag if you're recording these species. An important point with this is that until recently, Icenia andreae was only known from commercial cultures of Icenia foetida. So Icenia foetida compost worm, it's bred in captivity for commercial use, for sale to general public, etc. And we assumed that everything that we found in the wild would be Icenia foetida, regardless of how stripy it is, because Icenia andreae hadn't been recorded in the wild. When I went out and did some DNA work with the Darwin Tree of Life project, the earthworms that I identified as Icenia foetida came back as Icenia andreae. And when we look back at the pictures of the live earthworms, like the one here, we found that, yeah, they weren't actually quite as stripy as we'd expect for Icenia foetida. So we now class this as a species that is also found in the wild. So although we know it from compost, we also know it can be found associated with deadwood. So we can assume that it can be found wherever you could find Icenia foetida, you could probably find this as well. And it may even be that this is the more common one in the wild. We need to do further research to figure that out. So the confirmed records that we have are relatively few for this. So for now, we would say it could be a near threatened species. It's got a restricted distribution. It's very rare with a high habitat specificity. But really what we need to do is some in-depth research into the microhabitats where you would find Icenia foetida or Icenia andreae. And we need to look at the specimens that we collect in depth and figure out whether they are andreae or whether they are foetida. So at the moment, I'm not confident to say which is more common. They might be equal, one might be more common than the other. So watch this space. So I just want to finish off with a genus of species called Bimastus. So Bimastus, although you can't completely tell from this map, is a North American genus of earthworm. And most of the records of Bimastus species actually come from Europe. And part of the reason for that is in Europe, we're much better at making our data publicly available. So it's all available on the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. As we can see here, the map's much more lit up for Europe. But there was a research paper, and the link should be going in the chat now, from earthworm researchers from across the globe, so including earthworm researchers in the USA, but also Hungary and China, or maybe Hong Kong, looking at the taxonomy of Bimastus. And what they've evidenced is that Bimastus is an American group of earthworms, so its biogeography tells us from the last ice ages that it was found in North America, not in Europe. So we've got two species within this genus. First is Bimastus rubidus, which is known as the bankworm or the tree worm. You can see here superficially it can look very similar to Icenia tetraedra. It's an epigeic earthworm. It's found on the top above ground usually, so in dead wood, leaf litter, places like that. And it previously used to be called Dendrobilus rubidus. So if you're looking at old ID guides, it'll say it's a British species with this name. Now that research paper that I just referenced, that recategorized this as one of the Bimastus species, meaning even though it was quite commonly stated that it was a non-native species in America and a native species here, it's actually the other way around. So this species has colonized Europe from North America. So it means that we actually should be classing it as a non-native species. Now, we're not saying that this is necessarily an invasive species. We don't know how long it's been here. We don't know if it has any impact on any of our native species. So it's not something right now we're worried about. It is quite widespread. Its habitat specificity is moderate. It tends to be associated with deadwood, leaf litter, etc. But it is relatively common. So this is something that came out of the conservation status assessment that I was doing. Until then, it was still classed as a native species. It was also really underrepresented, like Icenia foetida was, in a lot of the data until the recording scheme started, because you don't tend to find it in the soils, but the recorders that are going out tend to find it in the microhabitats they're looking at. So another species that falls within this category is Bimastus icenii. That is another epigeic species, and that used to be called Allelobophoridella icenii. It was recategorized through that same paper into the Bimastus genus. So this is another one that we now would class as non-native. So it's relatively uncommon, although I think that might change with time. Not because I think it's increasing, but because I think it's been really under-recorded because of its microhabitat specificity to deadwood-associated microhabitats. So you quite often find this under things, but it's also, if you look in rot holes in trees or in the leaf litter that's gathered in the forks of trees where it started breaking down, you'll get this species fairly regularly. So it does seem to like arboreal microhabitats as well. So this is a climbing earthworm that you'll find above ground. You will also find it under logs, etc., on the ground. But yeah, we've not had it recorded in Northern Ireland yet. So I think it's most probably there. It's been recorded in the southern part of the island, so the Republic of Ireland, but we need to keep our eye out for that in Northern Ireland. That's partly to do with nobody's really looking in those microhabitats in Northern Ireland, and you see it's quite sparse in Scotland. Again, microhabitats have not been searched in depth in Scotland, so it's highlighting here a need to look further. Just like with Bimastus rubidus, we don't really know if or what impact it might have on our native species. At the moment, it's not something we're particularly worried about. So that's it for today. I just want to mention again the Earthworms of the UK Part 2, where we'll look at some more species. And the link for that is going in the chat.